This is Ikutaro Kakahashi. This image is taken from the front cover of his book, titled, I Believe in Music, written in 2002 in conjunction with the 30th anniversary of the company he founded, the Roland Corporation. Roland today is one of the largest producers of electronic music instruments, using various technologies to produce everything from synthesizers to electric organs and pianos to digital audio workstations and sample sound libraries. Kakahashi founded Roland in 1972 in Osaka, Japan, following a series of successful business endeavors in consumer electronics that began in the 1950s with Kakahashi, as a young man, repairing watches and clocks. His inquisitive and inventive spirit worked to his advantage during a period in post-war Japan where Western technology and infrastructure were entering the country's markets and brain trust. Along with Western technology to Japan came Western popular culture, specifically American. Contemporary American music was programmed on Japan's newly reopened public radio, and it was under the influence of this music, perhaps, that Kakahashi decided to channel his business and engineering efforts into the expansion of electronic music instruments. In speaking of Roland's work ethos, Mr. Kakahashi writes in his book, quote, "It is important that the manufacturing side concentrate on providing useful devices to meet creative wishes. It is not the proper role of a manufacturer to demand that the artist perform totally new playing methods. That would merely be an attempt to exploit novelty devices that had been dreamed up by arrogant designers." Unquote. This is Tadao Kikumoto, currently the senior managing director of the Roland Corporation. During Roland's beginning years, he was a product engineer and in the early 1980s set out to work on a new bass instrument, one that could potentially offer an acceptable alternative to the widely popular electric bass, which was itself a semi-new instrument, having been invented in 1951 by Leo Fender for the Fender Musical Instruments Corporation. In 1982, Roland released Kikumoto's invention, the TB-303 Bassline, to Western markets, having a retail price of about $400. Aimed at the pop music market, Roland hoped it would help offer musicians who did not have the means to hire or retain a bass player a chance to effectively incorporate bass lines into their composing process. Coupled with the already released Roland TR-606 Drummatics drum computer, which allowed users to create and automatically replay their own rhythm patterns, the 303 further helped point the way towards a populist emblem of the one-man or virtual band. Both the electric bass and the 303 relied on amplification to make sounds. In other words, you had to plug them into bass amplifiers to hear them make any noise. But that is where the similarities ended. The electric bass guitar design had its heritage in Western stringed instruments, particularly the contrabass, whereas the 303 had its roots in the control interface of the analog synthesizer. The electric guitar's controls usually consisted of 4 strings, although more could be incorporated, the neck with its frets, the tuning heads, and tone control and volume control knobs. The TB-303 also consisted of a tone knob, called filter cutoff, and a knob for volume adjustments. Beyond that, it included knobs for tuning, which could increase the octave range to 4, resonance, envelope modulation, decay, and accent. Further change to the timbre of the machine could be achieved by switching between 2 waveforms, sawtooth or sine wave. Certainly, it seemed the 303 offered a wide variety of flexibility and control in shaping bass sounds. One played the 303 not through any strings, but via a pseudo-keyboard that consisted of buttons on its front that ran across a 1-octave range. The buttons also doubled in duty as storage banks, with each one being able to keep a bassline pattern in memory. The 303 could create, but also record and play back, a chain of patterns to form an overall bassline composition. In spite of the 303 being a bit unorthodox when compared to a guitar-type instrument, Roland, perhaps with great confidence in their new product, or perhaps with desire to move product so as to quickly recoup initial production costs, shipped the 303 to Western markets without an English instruction manual. When English manuals did become available, Its first pages introduced the instrument with the following paragraph. Quote, F. How to use this manual. The switches and control knobs have several functions, so operating the TB303 may seem a little complicated. You may find difficulty using the TB303 at first, because it is so different from a bass guitar or keyboard instrument. Therefore, this manual includes a basic, intermediate, and advanced course to help you understand these operations step by step. However, each individual operation is quite simple, so take your time and master each step." Unquote. After reading the 90-page manual and familiarizing oneself with the operation of the 303, one could begin to coax bass lines out of the silver, battery-powered box. This is Craig Johnson, who lives in Southern California. In 1982, Craig purchased a TB303. In correspondence recently written to this author, he goes on to state, quote, "I'm a songwriter #1, and my initial intention was to make demos and ultimately do so from my own privately built studio. As you already know, a bass is a key ingredient to most ensembles, and I knew I needed that ingredient for my demos. Seeing as how I'm a guitar player, I felt it would be a fairly simple transition to an electric bass and was considering buying one. But when the 303 came out, I went in that direction because I felt I wouldn't need to invest the practice time. I loved the flexibility of the 303 and thought that I could make it sound somewhat human, but with that comes a higher learning curve and more creative capabilities, both of which equate to increased time. I probably invested not more than 24 hours total time into the 303. All in all, I didn't have the time to invest, and what demos I did, I reluctantly paid alternative studios to do." Unquote. In 1984, 2 years after Roland released the TB303 Bassline, production of it stopped, with about 20,000 units being manufactured. That the 303 did not succeed in a 1984 music market is not to suggest that one couldn't get a decent electric bass type sound from the machine when programmed according to Roland's instruction manual. There were, for example, some early 80s UK recording acts who released pop tracks with 303 made bass lines using Roland's offered methods.
This is nowhere alright. After justice last night, beyond the law and so high, way past reason, oh my, I get away.
So it wasn't so much that the 303 had timbral shortcomings, as much as it seemed to lack easy pattern and improvisation flexibility. Put simply, it was hard to play. A composer would have to invest serious time and tedious programming to attain a type of pattern structure that could be more quickly realized using traditional bass guitar approaches. But what type of music suited the 303, if any? Perhaps, if we point to a track from early 80s electro and breakdance culture, we'll hear an instance where raising the 303's octave range up and programming just one pattern repeatedly, in other words, playing the 303 not according to any accepted convention, provided a musical expression different from the usual lower octave bassline structure of other pop music.